father, I'm a husband, and I want my daughter to know that she can grow up and that her life is going to be valuable just like everybody else that grew up with.
We gotta work harder, smarter, harder. We gotta work harder, smarter, harder. Do this for the mamas, fathers, daughters, and the sons. In City Springs, a black man has never won. When it's all said and done, Carter gon' get it done. He might be running from man, but he ain't never run from the problems in the world we tryna overcome. They raising the taxes for lower tax brackets. How that make sense, man?
Good evening, good evening, good evening. What's up, everybody? I'm trying to do as many of these weekly as I can. It's just, as y'all know, it's just so much that goes on in the city of Sandy Springs that nobody talks about because we're this super small suburb is what they like to refer to us. But I think it's important to really have these conversations, because when the elections start up and we get full into election season, I mean, we're in election season, but not in it, right? And so when we get into election season, what we typically see is this push to get out very small fragments of information to talk about what's going on. And I just think it's important to really have some in-depth conversations. One of the things that I wanted to do first and foremost is really just shout out a good friend of mine, former colleague in the journalism space, neighbor here in Sandy Springs, Mike Pachinik. It was so encouraging to hear him speak up. And, I had actually gone back and forth about whether or not to even show up and have this conversation at City Hall. And I had talked to a few attorneys, talked to a few close friends, and it always turns into this thing of, when Dontaye shows up, it changes from the issue to he's running for mayor. He's only here because he's running for mayor, right? And so sometimes my absence in these spaces can be best. And so I'm very cognizant of that. But to hear him speak passionately, eloquently about his life experience as a Jewish man, but also this right to the First Amendment and free speech, right? And it's difficult, right? He sits in a place that I don't, and we always feel this, right? What I'm really in the space of is not putting my life experience over somebody else's or having somebody else put their life experience over me. I think it's important that we all have that space and grace for our life experiences to breathe, right? We all have a shared humanity here. And so I wanted to get in with Sandy Springs. They called it an anti-hate ordinance. And they said it would prevent folks who are spreading anti-Semitic literature around town from doing so. And so they created this overnight ordinance, which really infringes on free speech. But what we're going to do right now is what I want to do first and foremost is I want to start by playing Mike Pachinik's speech at City Hall. I just think it's really, really important to share that. And let me pull this up. And that's what I'm going to do right now is play it. And so without further ado, we're going to get it rolling right here.
So back in 2023, a neo-Nazi group littered my neighborhood's lawns, including my own, with hate-filled leaflets seeking to sow fear in the Jewish community, of which I am a part. And while their messages were hurtful, because they didn't overtly threaten anybody in my neighborhood, the Sandy Springs police, while great in showing up and investigating, told me there was little they could do about it. I don't have to tell you that post-October 7th, these situations have escalated across the country and here at home, on college campuses, on social media, and beyond. And while I fully support steps to prevent spreading hate, I applaud the ACLU, I applaud the city for taking steps to squash hateful rhetoric. As a recovering journalist and a proponent of free speech, I would ask you to proceed with caution and not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. As I understand it, the ordinance as written could preclude legitimate news outlets such as the Sandy Springs Crier from distributing its newspapers in our community. At a time when free and fair journalism is under attack like we've never seen before, newspapers remain a critical component of our community, and the information they deliver to our driveways overnight, even during the day, provides vital information to your constituents. Again, I want to make it clear, I fully support the idea behind what you're hoping to achieve. Hate has no place in this community, whether it's targeting Jews or anybody. I ask the council to please, though, as you deliberate, carve out an exception for legitimate media outlets and legitimate free speech. Please do not allow the law of unintended consequences to restrain freedom of press in the name of stopping anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Griffin.
This this was extremely important to be said, right? Because in a democracy, in a place where under the U.S. Constitution, where we have a right to free speech, we do at times toe a very fine line, right? And that line from free speech to, okay, that's a threat or you're violating the law, is again, once it hits that threat space, right, where you are being targeted, where very similar to I dealt with when I was running for mayor the first time, when somebody sent me an email saying, hey, you keep this up, your daughter's going to be growing up without a father. These things are important because we got to have these conversations and have them as an entire community, right? And it really frustrated me because I know there were a lot of people that had something to say but felt alienated because of how this ordinance was crouched in, right? And that's why I really appreciated the courage that, again, my friend, my neighbor, Mike Pachinik had when speaking boldly about, hey, what happened to my house and so many of my neighbors is wrong, but we also have to be honest and careful about violating the First Amendment, right? And we all have First Amendment rights. And so it's important for us, right, to have these conversations and have them in a way where we're ensuring that we're not violating anybody else's rights in the process. And oftentimes that gets lost. And so I really appreciated that. I had an article that was pulled up that I was gonna just quickly read from, and I'll probably just do it right here really quickly. Honestly, I can pull it up. I was trying to find the actual legislation. I found it last time. I had pulled it up on online. I'll just read this WSB article real quick. It says Sandy Springs passes new hate crime safety laws. It says in a decisive move to lessen hate crimes and improve community safety, Sandy Springs City Council approved a series of ordinances Tuesday night aimed at limiting the spread of hateful rhetoric and creating safer spaces for public expression. The council passed the measures with near unanimous support, with only one dissenting vote amid debate over potential First Amendment implications. That's what you heard my friend Mike Pachinik speaking on, right? And it says the new ordinance includes a ban on overnight canvassing in response to disturbing flyers recently left in residence yards. And so what you and I probably should have shared this screen. I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Let me see. But I wanna share, and I'm gonna share this this letter because the ACLU actually responded to it as well, which I think is important to note in this. And I'm gonna pull it up right here. Yes, here it goes. Boom. And so you're going to see it right here. This is the letter that the ACLU of Georgia sent to the city of Sandy Springs. And it's dated April 1st, 2025. And there have been a series of conversations that have been had about this. And so, again, we have to be honest about and protecting folks, ensuring that we're also protecting the First Amendment rights as well. Mike spoke to the impact this will have with news media, Sandy Springs Crier, Sandy Springs Reporter. Many of these folks deliver newspapers overnight. Folks will walk outside. Yes, they still deliver newspapers. They'll walk outside, and that newspaper will be on their doorsteps when they come in the morning. That infringes on that. This is also something that the one of the three ordinances that talked about also tackled protest and how they would be going forward in the city hall. If you go back and if you go to if you go to YouTube and Google Sandy Springs City Council, the entire meeting's recorded, and you'll hear the police chief talking about arresting people. Right? That's a clear violation of the law. People are protesting. You're talking about arresting them because of how they're protesting, what signs they have. If it's not a direct threat to bodily harm, to property, these are things that violate. If you arrest these folks, it violates their First Amendment rights, which is under the U.S. Constitution. I think it's important to have this conversation. I'm getting ready to read the letter from the ACLU of Georgia, but it's important to have this conversation because what this points out is, as much as this city wants to give off the perception of they're diverse, they're inclusive, it's not. It's not. It's not. What City Hall is dealing with is what the schools in our area have had to deal with for the past few years, right? We have this is an extremely diverse community, and sometimes when we have folks who live in our community who have moved here from other countries, right? There may be tensions in those other countries that come here, and we as a community have to decide how we work together, how we live together, right? And we have to find a way to get to the humanity part of this, because that's what it's about, right? It's about humanity. It's about acknowledging and understanding that there's a shared humanity, and that in that shared humanity, it's also acknowledging that me voicing my frustrations over how things are happening is also a First Amendment right that's guaranteed. And I know folks, they want to draw these black and white. They want to make these conversations so black and white, and they're not. But I think we have to be able to have these conversations, right? In a way where multiple sides, because it's not just one or two, right? That's 1950s, right? We're dealing with very multi-layered sides, right? And we have to be able to create spaces where we can have these conversations as a community. And part of this is, and again, I'm going to jump in and read the ACLU letter to the Sandy Springs City Council. And it says proposed buffer zone. That was on the protest issue, and overnight solicitation and canvassing ordinances. It says, Dear Sandy Springs City Council members, the ACLU of Georgia writes to you in response to the proposed buffer zone and overnight solicitation and canvassing ordinances that were discussed during the January 7, 2025 and March 18, 2025 Sandy Springs City Council work sessions. The buffer zone ordinance was then amended on March 31st, 2025. We share your dismay at the distribution of anti-Semitic propaganda across the city of Sandy Springs and Metro Atlanta more broadly. We write to express our deep concerns that despite their good intentions, the ordinances would violate speakers' right to free speech. The First Amendment is a cornerstone of our nation's laws and thus has robust protections. The right to free speech includes the right to attempt to persuade others to change their views. Hill versus Colorado, which is a case that the city cited, but they cited in their defense. But I don't think it quite fit. If you actually look at the case, it was dealing with abortion and anti-abortion protesters running up on women in front of a clinic, which they're already going through a very traumatic time in their life, right? Last thing they need is somebody running up on them, right, as they're going to make this decision. And so that's what the Hill versus Colorado was about. And so I just wanted to give it some clarity there. And then it says of particular relevance here, the United States Supreme Court has determined that handing out leaflets in the advocacy of politically controversial viewpoint is the essence of First Amendment expression. No form of free speech is entitled to greater constitutional protection. And they cited where that was decided in McCullen versus Coakley. It says even free speech, even speech we vehemently disagree with, nevertheless, is protected by the guarantees of the United States and Georgia Constitution. See Snyder versus Phillips. As a nation, we have chosen to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate, right? And they also cited Freeman versus State. It's important because these issues here with Freeman versus State, Snyder versus Phillips, like honestly, this is where when folks wonder why the KKK can still protest and why police have to, close off streets so they can march. And I can't remember one in recent times, but I do remember a big KKK march when I was growing up. And when we hear folks and they're saying very racist, misogynistic things, why these things are protected. It's letting you know here why it's protected, right? And it says if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. In accordance with these principles, the government may only regulate speech when imposing time, place, or manner restrictions that one apply to all messages, irrespective of the particular content, two are narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest, and three leave open ample alternative channels for communication of the information. Right. Then it cites another case, Hirsch versus City of Atlanta. To be narrowly tailored, the regulation must not burden substantially more speech that is necessary to further the government's legitimate interests. Right? Goes back to cite McCullen. It says the buffer zone ordinance expansive prohibitions, fail to meet that test. The government's legitimate interest in preventing anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination and protecting the public's peace and safety may support certain restrictions, but the buffer zone ordinance's broad prohibitions on passing leaflets, displaying signs, or engaging in protests burden substantially more speech than is necessary to further that interest. Government infringement upon the free flow of information in public forums is deemed legitimate only in limited context, like when a passerby has a competing privacy interest at stake, such as when accessing healthcare or attending a funeral. And then it goes on to list several of the cases where they pulled from, right? Supreme Court cases. And it says the buffer zone ordinance, on the other hand, applies to seemingly any and all exercise of the constitutionally protected right to engage in direct face-to-face communication and applies to all locations across the city. The buffer zone ordinance burdens substantially more speech than necessary to achieve the city's interest, and it cannot pass constitutional muster. The buffer zone ordinance's broad restrictions on speech also fail to leave open, ample alternative communication channels. In a situation where a speaker wants to reach the general public, the buffer zone ordinance actively forecloses also every kind of speech that would be available to such a speaker. Courts have routinely held that face-to-face communication can be the most effective form of protected speech, noting that door-to-door distribution or mass mailing telephone campaigns are not effective alternate avenues of communication. It says preventing the ability to interact in person, however, momentarily strips petitioners of using speech in the time, place, and manner most vital to the protected expression. And so they're really getting into the weeds of this. And, another part that I didn't talk about is the impact, right, that this can have on, let's say folks are running for public office, right? They're sending out mailers, they're sending out different information, right? Now you're attempting to penalize them, right, for using their free speech and running for public office. And this is where, again, we have to be able to have these conversations in an open way. But again, how this conversation came up, right? I think there weren't a lot of people who felt as though this conversation would be open to a much broader conversation. And so that's why I give the ACLU, I give my buddy Mike Pachinik kudos for acknowledging what happened was wrong with passing out the anti-Semitic literature, but also acknowledging that we have a First Amendment right here, and it's important for us to continue right to ensure that, because again, without the law, right, what do we have? That Constitution, and y'all have heard me say this before in previous meetings. That's the agreement between us and the government, right? That outlines who's on what side, how things are supposed to go. We reading through that document, we gain an understanding of how our government functions and 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 what's accepted behavior for us within the bounds of the United States of America, right? The same with the Georgia state constitution, the same with the Sandy Springs Charter. And so the case that the ACLU of Georgia is bringing up is, hey, within the bounds of this agreed contract, right, between the government and the people, there's a violation, and we have to address that. And so, and this is something again that I've had conversations with attorneys about. I had every Democrat in 2022 that was running statewide yard sign in my front yard, and because the city passed an ordinance that said there could only be 2 signs in the yard, they continued to fine me, right? But that's a violation of my free speech. I should be able to put as many signs up in my yard, right? It's my yard, private property, da 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 da. But again, we have and this is just me being frank and honest, we have an extremely conservative city council who came in when this city was very much conservative and Republican. It's shifted greatly since, right? But that's they're governing through that very conservative lens, and that very conservative lens, right? Um, on how we interact socially, right, is impacting a lot of people. And so it's important for us that when we see ordinances, when we see laws, when we see legislation that isn't right, that we speak up. And so again, shout out to the ACLU, shout out to Mike for really addressing this, right? Because these things need to be addressed. It's important to be addressed, right? Because we may not see the impact of it now, but what does that impact look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? And again, that the ordinance on yard signs was something that I felt pretty quickly, right? Because when I put up all the yard signs in my front yard, and I was just like, wow, I got Stacy's sign, I got Jen Jordan's sign, I got all these signs up. But because they said it was too many signs, and my neighbor called and said, oh, you're violating the ordinance. And it's like, yeah, but what supersedes the ordinance that you wrote to infringe on my rights? It's the U.S. Constitution, which grants me, the right to free speech. And so, needless to say, me and my attorney, Gerald Griggs, Mr. Good Trouble, went to court, and it was all dismissed. So all these fines that were, levied on me for not taking these signs out of my yard were ultimately dismissed, which we knew they would, because the ordinance, it was clearly in violation of the First Amendment. And I've spoken to several attorneys, even here in the city of Sandy Springs, who this is their biggest issue. There are so many ordinances that are on the books that people don't know about that violate, right? That violate our First Amendment rights. And they want us to operate a certain way. And when we don't, they fine it. Well, you can't fine us if the ordinance that you previously wrote is in violation of the First Amendment right. And so I understand that every elected official is not an attorney, but I would hope that every elected official would at least have read the U.S. Constitution, would at least have read the Georgia Constitution, would at least have read, I don't know, the Sandy Springs Charter, right? Because these things, right, they're what define the powers of the mayor, the powers of the city council. And so when I push back on certain things, it's because I've read these documents. When I push back on certain things, it's because I understand that while politically you're using this a certain way for a very specific reason, right? we also understand that from a constitutional standpoint, from a legal standpoint, it's wrong. And so Sandy Springs passed this ordinance 5-1. Um, and I could tell you, once it's levied, there are going to be lawsuits. The city's been sued several times. You know, the one of our local media, App and Media, I believe they've got 2 lawsuits out on the city over open records, and so it's the city hasn't done the best job with following the Constitution. And I say best job, and that's saying it nicely, right? I'm in a good mood, so I don't feel like slandering anybody. Well, not slandering, but going hard. Um, but I just we just have to be honest about what's happening and what we're doing here. And so let me let me finish reading this here. And it says the ability to gather and disseminate information is a core principle of speech and press freedoms under the United States and Georgia constitutions. Is really like so. The Sandy Springs Charter was put together by the city, but its powers are governed by the Georgia Constitution. The Georgia Constitution is governed by the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution, right? That is the overriding document. That's it, right? That's it. And so you're going to see that the ACLU is going to continuously refer back to the U.S. Constitution and the Georgia Constitution. It says overnight solicitation and canvassing ordinance threatens the speech and press rights of news organizations in Sandy Springs by prohibiting the nighttime distribution of news materials and is adequately narrowly tailored to achieve the city's stated interest. Freedom of speech is one of the most critical forms found in this state and nation. Ordinances, while having noble intentions, will violate speakers' rights as guaranteed by both the United States and Georgia constitutions. For these reasons, the ACLU of Georgia urges the council not to adopt the ordinances, right? And it was signed there by their attorneys, policy director, legal director, staff attorney. And so what you're seeing is this was all reviewed by attorneys. Newspapers went ahead and interviewed different attorneys. And so again, y'all, what I really want to emphasize is what's happening in DC right now with 47 is a microcosm of what's been happening on our local levels for a long time, right? This whole states' rights, freedom of speech. We've been in this, like, while it may not have been in front of everybody, this is that fight that we've been in for a very long time. And it doesn't surprise me that this is happening in Sandy Springs because, as many of you know, the mayor is the former Georgia GOP chair, chair of the Republican Party of Georgia, the former one, right? It doesn't surprise me that a man that endorsed Donald Trump would also put this together, right? And so I think it's just important for us to realize that we're in a day and time where we are seeing the importance of local and state elections. And it's important to make sure that we're having a real conversation about these things, right? And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the brightest or sharpest tool in the shed. I know that, right? But I've had a lot of friends and a lot of good lawyer friends who've helped to educate me on this process for years. This isn't something that just happened last year, right? This has been something that's, for me, has been continuing, right? And I think that the more and more I sit down and I'm comparing what's on paper within the city and what's on this U.S. Constitution, those are the things that raise the most questions for me. Because again, democracy only works when you're working for everybody, right? Like you can't, this whole hierarchy of we're going to lift up and work in the best interest of this group while the majority of folks are struggling and suffering is a problem. And so we've got a lot of work to do. And so again, I want to thank the ACLU. I want to thank my friend, my former colleague, my neighbor, Mike Pachenik, for for standing on the side of truth and justice, and having the courage to do so, because I know this is an uncomfortable place, and we've had conversations, with protest and free speech. And so there have been a lot of conversations that he and I have had. And so to see him step up, speak proudly, speak boldly, I'm really inspired by this brother. And I really believe in, when folks take stands like this, right? Powerful stands. Like, yeah, we shout them out. Yeah, we tell them we appreciate them, because again, this when we talk about this US Constitution and that very long run-on sentence, that first run-on sentence, there's multiple run-on sentences in there, right? But that first run-on sentence where it says, in order to form a more perfect union, we establish justice. Y'all, we got to remember what justice means, right? Justice means we're treating each and everybody fairly. Justice means we're standing up for everybody, right? And we can stand up for humanity. We can stand against oppression. We can stand against all these things, right? And still stand up for humanity, and still love our brothers, and still look and find the love in our shared humanity, right? Because we are. And Dr. King had a very famous quote, right? Where he said, it doesn't matter how we got here, we're all in the same boat now. And so I just think that as we're having these conversations and we're talking about equity, we're talking about, because, a lot of folks don't want to talk, they want to say DEI. They hate DEI without saying they hate diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we got to start saying it, right? Not allowing them to simplify it down to three letters. But when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and embracing all of these things, we have to talk about how we show up for one another. And that's key. And many of y'all know we got a protest happening on Saturday, 12:30, Piedmont Park, where multiple organizations, I think we're almost at a dozen at this point, are coming together, right? Human Rights, NAACP, 5051, right? Indivisible, all these groups coming together to make their voices heard. And we got people from all walks of life, right? Who are coming together because we're looking at the shared humanity. Excuse me. We understand the importance of us being together, being one together, right? And allowing our voices to be elevated together. And that's what this is about. This is about saying, hey, we're not going to tolerate anti-Semitic literature in our community, but we're also not going to violate the First Amendment rights of anybody else in our community. And again, right, this is, when I see this, when I first saw it, right, I didn't even look at it from the news organization standpoint. I looked at it from the standpoint of people running for public office, because that's what I do as serving as a North Fulton Dems chair, serving as the first vice president of the Atlanta NAACP. I'm always looking at these things of, okay, we're getting the word out about engagement, voting, right? All these things. And so that's what hit me first in this whole discussion. That's what hit me first. And so I'm pretty sure I'm seeing we got a lot of folks on here, and I'm pretty sure that there are going to be a lot of comments. I promise I'm going to get to the comments. I know there are going to be some people that, because I'm running for mayor, probably going to chop and screw this thing. So what I wanted to say, or what I said, didn't come out the way it did over the live stream, right? They like to take those little snippets. But listen, this is about humanity. This is about the city residents, and this is about the impact of ordinances like this. And I can tell you right now, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time before this city gets sued again. And I say again because they have a habit of getting sued. They have a habit of wasting taxpayer money on lawyers defending bad legislation or ordinances that they've written and passed. And so we just we have to have a real conversation about what's happening, where we're going, because what I know is we got 6 Title I schools in the city. We got one on the north end with 100% economically disadvantaged student population. We got another one with 87% economically disadvantaged student population. We got an incredibly high number of students who are homeless in our public school system. And as high as 30%. And so I just think it's important that we keep the main thing, and really focus on what the real issues are, because we still ain't got a rec center here. Um, there's a lot that if we're talking about building one Sandy Springs, and a Sandy Springs that's together, truly together, that we work on and do. And so I didn't want to ramble on. I just wanted to bring this to your attention. Again, this is now an ordinance that is on the books. It was voted in 5-1. Can't believe that. But again, I just want to thank the ACLU of Georgia for what they did. It's important that our city council folks are reminded that everybody has First Amendment rights, and that you can't violate First Amendment rights. I understand what they were trying to do politically, but I also understand that you can't make something that's constitutional illegal, and on face value, a Supreme Court will dismiss that, right? And so we got to have a real conversation about these things. And so I just want to thank y'all for tuning in with us. Again, you can find the entire meeting, the Sandy Springs City Council meeting, on YouTube. It's on their Sandy Springs City Council channel. If you Google Sandy Springs and click the news icon, all these stories will come up. You'll see the letter from the ACLU. You'll see several news stories that I think could have been written better, but weren't. But to see a former, news journalist that I worked alongside, again, Mike Pachinik, stand up and say what he said so powerfully, I have to commend that brother. Really appreciate him. And without further ado, y'all, I'm gonna roll out. Just want to thank y'all for tuning in. And, this is Unfiltered here with Mr. Carter. And I'll holler at y'all later. Peace.
I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I want my daughter to know that she can grow up and that her life is going to be valuable just like everybody else that grew up with.
We gotta work harder, smarter.